When I saw my husband picking up the folded sweater from the chair, I didn't think much of it, until his hand brushed against a paper tucked beneath it. My breath caught. Not because of guilt in the usual sense, but because of the handwriting on that paper. It wasn't mine. He looked at the card, squinting as if he had forgotten his glasses, and then read the first few words aloud, too casually, too slowly. I felt my stomach knot, my pulse drum in my ears. He asked, "Who left this here?" and I opened my mouth, but no words came out. His voice carried no accusation, no anger, just curiosity. That made it worse. Because 3 months ago, I had let a moment spiral into something I couldn't control. And now, with a single piece of paper, that spiral had finally reached the surface. I wanted to snatch the note away, tear it to shreds, but my legs wouldn't move. My fingers gripped the back of the kitchen chair so hard it creaked. His eyes scanned the rest of the words, and his expression shifted, confusion, then something sharper, as if a puzzle piece he didn't even know was missing had suddenly clicked into place. The silence stretched, and I could hear the old clock ticking on the wall, louder with every beat. He folded the note back up, set it down, and simply stared at me. I bit the inside of my cheek, the way I always do when I panic. And the truth pressed against my ribs, ready to spill out. Because what had started as harmless glances, as fleeting moments, had turned into the one mistake that would change everything. But let me start from the beginning, before that note, before the night, before the kiss that set it all in motion. I have lived in this house for almost 3 decades, and over time, it has grown quieter, not the comforting quiet of shared peace, but the hollow quiet of lives running parallel. The mornings began in silence. He sat at the table, newspaper open, glasses slipping down his nose, his hand mechanically lifting the same chipped mug of coffee. I would move around him, placing toast, clearing plates, folding laundry, like a shadow in my own kitchen. Nothing was wrong, exactly. That was the strange part. There were no arguments, no slammed doors, no late-night confessions. Just an almost invisible erosion, as if someone had taken an eraser to us and rubbed away the details. I had grown used to being invisible. Or maybe I had made myself invisible, it's hard to say which came first. The days blurred together. I had stopped wearing the red scarf he once said he liked. I had stopped asking if he wanted to go to the movies, because he always said he was tired. I stopped wondering if he noticed the way I looked when I left the hairdresser, because I knew the answer. But sometimes, in the evenings, when the house was so quiet that even the ticking clock felt too loud, I would sit at the kitchen table and remember who I used to be. A woman who laughed loudly. A woman who expected flowers. A woman who thought love could carry itself without tending. It was on one of those evenings that he mentioned, casually, that his cousin was coming to stay. Just for a few weeks, he said, barely looking up from the paper. The cousin needed help with some property paperwork, and our house was closest to town. I nodded. It sounded ordinary enough. But when the doorbell rang that Friday afternoon, and I opened it to see him standing there, bag slung over his shoulder, something shifted. He smiled, an easy, open smile, and for a moment, I felt caught off guard, as if sunlight had broken into a dim room. He was different from my husband. That was my first thought. Not better, not worse, just different. He moved through the house easily, not like a guest but like someone who remembered it from another time. He noticed things. He complimented the old oak table, ran his hand along its scratches and said, "It's got character." He laughed easily, the kind of laugh that fills a room, and it startled me, because I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard that sound in this kitchen. The first evening passed without incident. We had dinner, the 3 of us, and talked about the weather, about the repairs needed on the shed, about the old photos on the mantel. But later, when I was wiping the counter and he offered to dry the dishes, our hands brushed over the same plate. It was nothing. Just a touch. And yet, something in me jolted, like a wire sparking in the dark. I went to bed that night and lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My husband snored softly beside me. The sound, once comforting, now felt like a wall. My mind replayed the briefest things, the way the cousin had leaned against the kitchen door frame, the way he had said thanks when I handed him a glass of water, the way he had looked, not at me, exactly, but through me, as if I wasn't entirely invisible after all. The next morning, I told myself I was imagining things. That this was nothing more than the mild stirrings of a bored mind. But when I came into the kitchen, he was already there, pouring himself coffee. He looked up, smiled, and said, "Good morning." Simple words. But they landed differently. And I realized then that this house, my life, my marriage, all of it, was about to shift in ways I didn't yet understand. The second morning felt different, though I tried not to admit it to myself. I had woken before anyone else, padding across the cold kitchen floor, the tiles pressing their chill into the soles of my feet. I wanted to enjoy a quiet cup of coffee before the house stirred, before obligations and conversation filled the air. But when I opened the cupboard for the mugs, I found one already used on the counter. He was already awake. I turned and there he was, standing by the back door, looking out into the garden. He wore an old sweater that must have belonged to someone else before, it hung loosely on him, the sleeves rolled up carelessly, and his hair was still mussed from sleep. He looked nothing like the polished man who had arrived the day before. There was something disarmingly ordinary about the way he stood there, hand wrapped around a chipped mug, as if this was his home and he had always been part of these mornings. "Good morning," he said, his voice low, softened by the hour. I returned the words, but my own voice came out quieter, as if I were afraid of disturbing something delicate. The kitchen felt smaller with him in it, not cramped exactly, but full. Every movement seemed louder, the scrape of the chair against the floor, the sound of the kettle starting to boil, the soft shuffle of his socks on the tiles. I busied myself with simple tasks, pouring coffee, slicing bread, pretending to read the headlines on the newspaper left on the table. Anything to distract from the awareness prickling at the edges of my thoughts. Later that morning, my husband left for work. He had a meeting, he said, and might be late. He kissed me absent-mindedly on the cheek, a habitual gesture without thought, and then the door closed behind him. The silence that followed wasn't like the usual silence, it felt weighted, like it carried expectation. The cousin stayed behind to help move boxes from the attic. It was a job we'd been putting off for years, and now there was someone strong enough to do the lifting. I fetched the stepladder, and we both climbed into the dim attic space, where the air smelled of dust and forgotten things. We opened box after box, old holiday decorations, broken lamps, faded photographs, the odd bits of life no one knew where else to store. He found a stack of photo albums and sat on the wooden floorboards, flipping them open. "You looked different here," he said, showing me a photo of myself from years ago, smiling under the summer sun, hair tangled by the wind. I looked at that picture for longer than I meant to. I hardly recognized that woman, the way she held herself, the brightness in her eyes. I felt a faint ache of nostalgia, but also something else, something harder to name. We laughed as we unearthed old, ridiculous souvenirs, a hat shaped like a pineapple from some vacation, a chipped ceramic mug with a cartoon face. He teased me for keeping such junk, and I told him he didn't understand the value of silly things. Our laughter was genuine, ringing out through the dusty attic, and it startled me. How long had it been since I laughed like that in this house? When we were done, we carried the boxes down, arms brushing, shoulders bumping awkwardly as we maneuvered the narrow stairs. At one point, balancing a particularly heavy box, his hand covered mine to steady it. The touch was quick, purely practical, but it left a trace, like the faint warmth of sun on the skin after the light is gone. We set the boxes on the floor and began sorting through them in the living room. One box tipped over, and papers scattered across the rug. He bent down at the same time as I did, and our faces ended up closer than they should have been. I could smell the faintest trace of soap on his skin, mixed with dust from the attic. We both froze for a moment, then laughed awkwardly, though the laughter didn't feel the same as before. It felt thin, like a curtain pulled too tightly. At lunch, we sat across from each other. The kitchen table suddenly seemed smaller than ever. He asked questions about the garden, about the repairs needed in the shed, about my plans for the week. Ordinary questions, but he asked them like he cared about the answers, as if my answers mattered. I wasn't used to that. The afternoon dragged on in that quiet, stretched way that only happens when there's too much unspoken between two people. I went about my chores, folding laundry, watering plants, while being hyper-aware of his presence. When he passed me a glass, our fingers touched again. The same spark, the same slight jolt ran through me. By the time evening came, my husband still hadn't returned. The house was dim, shadows stretching across the walls. I went into the kitchen to put away the last of the dishes, and he came in, carrying another stack of boxes that needed to be flattened. I turned to thank him, and it happened. It wasn't planned, not even imagined. It was one of those moments that unfold faster than thought. A pause. A glance. A step too close. And then we kissed. It lasted only a breath, maybe two. Long enough for the world to tilt and then right itself, leaving everything subtly, irrevocably changed. We both pulled back, almost at the same time, and neither of us said a word. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was heavy, like the air before a storm. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, but I couldn't meet his eyes. I turned back to the sink, hands trembling slightly as I picked up a dish that didn't need washing. He lingered in the doorway for a moment, then set the empty box down and walked out quietly, his footsteps soft against the floorboards. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, staring at the ceiling. His steady breathing filled the room, the same sound I'd heard every night for years. But now it felt distant, like it belonged to another life, another version of me. I pressed my hand to my lips, as if the touch would erase what happened, or maybe make it real. I didn't know what to call what had just happened. A mistake? A crack in the dam? Or maybe just a kiss that shouldn't have been, but couldn't be undone. The morning after the kiss felt like waking into a slightly altered version of my life, everything the same, yet nothing the same. The kitchen still smelled of coffee, the clock still ticked too loudly, and the same muted sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, but I couldn't shake the memory of what had happened. It clung to me, as stubborn as the scent of something burned into fabric. I went about my morning routine almost automatically, each movement rehearsed 1,000 times, filling the kettle, reaching for mugs, slicing bread for toast. But every action felt magnified, as if I were under surveillance, except the only one watching me was myself. My husband sat at the table, sipping his coffee, reading headlines, entirely unaware that something had shifted beneath his feet. I studied him for longer than usual, looking for signs that he might sense it, the tiny shift in the air, the new tension stretched like a thread across the walls. But he just turned a page, adjusted his glasses, and asked if there was any more jam. When the cousin came down the stairs, I felt a jolt, like an electric pulse. He walked into the kitchen casually, like nothing had happened. That should have relieved me, but it didn't. He greeted me with the same polite morning, his voice even, his expression calm. It was as if he'd locked the memory of that kiss in a box and buried it. I tried to do the same, but my body betrayed me. My hand shook slightly when I handed him his coffee. My breath felt shallow when he reached past me to get a spoon from the drawer, his arm brushing against mine. None of it looked strange from the outside. That was the terrifying part, how normal it all looked, how easy it was to act like nothing had changed. After breakfast, my husband left for the day. He had errands to run, people to see, and as he closed the door, the silence fell heavy again. But this wasn't the silence I'd known for years, the comfortable, dull silence of routine. This silence felt fragile, full of things neither of us dared say. The cousin and I spent the morning tackling the boxes we'd hauled down from the attic. They sat piled in the corner of the living room like an audience, waiting for us to deal with them. We sorted through old clothes and papers, discarding what could be thrown away, setting aside what should be donated. The work should have been mindless, but my thoughts wouldn't stay still. Every so often, I caught his eyes on me, and we both looked away too quickly, like children caught doing something they shouldn't. We barely spoke. The few words exchanged were stripped of anything unnecessary. "This one's heavy. Careful, that box is tipping. Do you need the tape?" Harmless, ordinary words, but every syllable felt loaded. I caught myself glancing at his hands as he folded cardboard, the easy strength in the movement. I watched him stand, stretch, roll his sleeves back up his arms when they slipped down. It wasn't desire, not exactly, it was awareness. Acute, unrelenting awareness. By midday, I couldn't take the tightness in the air any longer. I suggested we take the last load to the shed, just to get out of the house. Outside, the air was cooler, a light breeze cutting through the heaviness. We carried boxes across the yard, the grass damp underfoot, and for a moment it felt easier to breathe. The shed smelled of dust and old wood, the kind of scent that settles into your skin. We stacked the boxes, one by one, and I brushed dirt off my hands, suddenly conscious of how close we were standing in that cramped space. There was a moment where neither of us moved, as if both waiting for the other to step back. He reached for a broom leaning against the wall, his shoulder grazing mine. That small, accidental contact felt louder than the scrape of the broom handle against the floor. When we walked back to the house, the silence between us wasn't awkward, it was deliberate, like we were both holding something fragile and dangerous between us and couldn't risk dropping it. Lunch was quiet. Too quiet. I placed a plate in front of him, and our fingers touched again. That fleeting brush of skin sent my heart racing faster than any conversation could have. I wondered if he felt it too, or if I was imagining everything, layering meaning onto nothing. The afternoon stretched long, the minutes dripping by like slow syrup. I found myself inventing tasks, cleaning the same countertop twice, rearranging already neat shelves, just to stay in motion. Still, every movement, every glance felt monitored, not by him, but by my own conscience. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror at one point. I didn't like what I saw, not my face exactly, but the way it looked back at me. My cheeks were flushed, though I hadn't been outside long. My eyes looked too alert, too alive. I stared at myself and wondered who I was becoming, or maybe who I had always been, buried under the years. By early evening, the house had settled into an uneasy rhythm again. My husband returned home, stepping into the kitchen with the same tired smile, asking about the day, as if everything was exactly as it should be. He talked about the traffic, about the weather, about how the neighbor's fence had finally been fixed. I nodded, responded, smiled in all the right places. But beneath my calm face, my mind kept replaying the kiss, the suddenness of it, the way the world seemed to tilt for a second. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how easily people can live in two realities at once, the one you show the world, and the one that plays quietly in the back of your mind. My husband slept soundly beside me, breathing in and out, his hand resting heavily on the blanket between us. And I lay there, staring into the dark, thinking about the cousin's hand brushing mine, his arm grazing my shoulder, the briefest moments that felt like stepping too close to the edge of something I wasn't ready to name. I told myself the kiss was a mistake, a momentary lapse. But deep down, I knew the truth, mistakes don't sit quietly. They ripple. They change the air. They make you wonder what will happen next. The days that followed seemed to fold in on themselves, each one nearly indistinguishable from the next, and yet every moment felt sharper, weighted. It was as though life in the house had been rewound and replayed, but with some imperceptible shift in tone, like a familiar song played in a slightly different key. Everything ordinary carried an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. I woke earlier than usual, moving through the house before anyone else, the silence of those hours both comforting and unbearable. I lingered longer over small things, wiping the counter, stacking the plates, folding a dish towel as if precision could drown the noise in my mind. When my husband sat down at the kitchen table, it was like watching a ritual I'd seen 1,000 times. He reached for the paper, poured his coffee, flipped through pages without looking up. His voice broke the quiet only once, asking if we needed more milk. That was it. The same line he had delivered 100 times before, delivered again with no awareness that everything in my head had changed. It amazed me, how unchanged his world seemed while mine felt like it was cracking in subtle ways only I could feel. The cousin came down not long after, his footsteps on the stairs soft but distinct. I caught myself listening for them, though I would never have admitted that to anyone. He walked into the kitchen like he belonged there, his presence unsettling precisely because it felt so natural. He smiled, nodded, poured himself coffee, and it should have been an ordinary moment, just another person moving through the rhythms of the house. But nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. I spent that morning telling myself that the kiss was nothing, that we had crossed no irreversible line, that the world would go on. But the world felt different, and so did I. Every movement in that kitchen, the way he opened a cupboard, the way he brushed past me to reach for a glass, seemed to carry a hum beneath it, like static on an old radio. It was sometime in the late morning when he mentioned, casually, that he needed to take a drive to deliver a few papers for my husband's property documents. My husband had asked him to do it the night before, he explained, because it was too far out of the way for him to manage this week. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Do you want to come along? It's a long drive alone." The question was tossed lightly, but I felt it settle in me like a stone dropping into water, ripples spreading out. I hesitated, glancing at the clock, though there was nothing urgent pressing on my day. The laundry could wait. The garden could wait. Everything could wait. I said finally, more to myself than to him, and found myself getting my bag. The car smelled faintly of dust and gasoline, that old, comfortable scent of long drives. The seats were worn, the dashboard cracked slightly in one corner, and the radio sputtered when he turned it on. He fiddled with the dial until a faint hum of music filled the space, a song I didn't recognize, soft and almost too quiet. We drove in near silence for the first few miles, the tires humming on the road. The world outside the windows was all faded greens and browns, the remnants of winter clinging stubbornly to the landscape. I watched the trees pass, watched the clouds move, anything to avoid thinking too much. But even in that quiet, there was an awareness between us, like an invisible thread pulling taut. Eventually, he spoke. He asked about the town we were driving to, about whether I'd been there before. I told him I had, once or twice years ago. That opened the door for more conversation, harmless, surface level, the kind of talk people have to fill the space on a long drive. But somewhere along the way, the words deepened. He asked about the early years of my marriage, about the trips my husband and I used to take, about the house and the garden and all the things I had built my life around. I answered honestly, though I wasn't sure why I was telling him some of the things I did. There was a moment, as the road curved through a stretch of empty fields, when he reached to adjust the heat dial, his hand brushing mine on the console. A brief touch, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone on any road. But my chest tightened all the same, and I felt my breath catch. The drive stretched on, the conversation meandering like the road itself. We talked about old music, about childhood summers, About the kind of inconsequential things that somehow carry the heaviest weight when shared with the right person. I found myself laughing at one point, really laughing, the kind of laugh that shakes loose something inside. It startled me, that laugh. It felt unfamiliar. When we stopped at a roadside cafe, it was more necessity than plan. The sky had begun to gray, and he suggested we take a break before finishing the drive. The cafe was nearly empty, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tastes like it's been sitting for hours. We sat across from each other, and the small table between us felt like the only barrier left. We didn't talk much there. We didn't need to. It was the silence that spoke, the pauses between sips of coffee, the way his eyes lingered on mine a second too long. I looked away more than once, staring at the chipped sugar dispenser, at the crooked sign on the wall, anywhere but him. Back in the car, the silence felt even heavier. The music from the radio was low, barely audible, just a faint hum beneath the sound of the road. There were no more questions, no more casual observations. Just the quiet and the unspoken. By the time we pulled into the driveway that evening, it felt like we had traveled much further than the miles on the odometer. The house looked the same, the garden the same, the sky the same, but everything inside me felt slightly altered. We carried the papers inside, setting them on the table, and he thanked me for coming along, his voice steady, his expression calm. But his eyes gave him away. That night, as I stood in the kitchen cleaning the same counter for the third time, I thought about the drive. About the silence and the laughter and the accidental brush of hands. I thought about how easy it was to step into that car and how hard it felt to step back into this house. When I finally went to bed, my husband's breathing filled the dark room, steady and unchanging. I lay there, my eyes tracing the faint outlines of the ceiling, and wondered how many more days could pass before the line we'd been skirting stopped being invisible. The house felt heavier after that drive, as though we had carried something back with us that didn't fit between its walls. Nothing had been said, not in the car, not when we stepped into the kitchen, not as we went our separate ways that evening. But the silence between us wasn't empty, it was thick, stretched, charged. Every time I looked at him, I felt it pressing against my ribs. The next morning came like any other, sunlight creeping in pale slats across the bedroom floor, my husband's steady breathing next to me, the faint hum of the heater in the hallway. But I woke with that restless feeling, the sense that something had been set in motion and couldn't be stopped. My movements felt rehearsed, slippers on, robe tied, coffee poured. Everything familiar, but nothing normal. My husband left earlier than usual that day, muttering about errands and calls he needed to make, his mind already elsewhere. He kissed my cheek in that distracted way, the one that always made me wonder if he even noticed me anymore. The door closed behind him, and I stood there for a moment, staring at it, feeling the quiet settle again. The cousin came down the stairs later, his hair still damp from the shower, his shirt wrinkled in a way that looked careless rather than messy. He greeted me simply, the same as always, but there was a flicker in his eyes when they met mine, an acknowledgement neither of us dared to name. We spent the morning doing the sort of things that should have been simple. Folding laundry. Straightening up the living room. Passing each other in the narrow hallway, each step an exercise in control. Every brush of fabric, every handoff of a dish or a towel felt louder than the words we weren't saying. It started to rain in the early afternoon, the kind of steady rain that makes the world seem smaller, the sound of it filling every room, muting everything else. My husband called to say he'd be staying out longer than planned, his voice casual, unaware. When I hung up the phone, I stood for a long moment by the window, watching the rain blur the garden into muted greens and grays. He came into the kitchen then, holding a bottle of olive oil in one hand. "Do you want to cook?" he asked, his voice too neutral. I nodded, though my throat felt tight, and before I knew it we were standing side by side, chopping vegetables, stirring pots, moving around each other like some quiet dance. The rain tapped on the windows, the stove hissed, and between those sounds was the soft hum of our silence. At one point, he reached for a jar on the high shelf, standing close behind me, and I felt his breath against my shoulder. My hands stilled on the cutting board. I wanted to step away, but I didn't. We sat down to eat in that quiet, the table set for two, the sound of rain still drumming outside. The meal was simple, but I could hardly taste it. Every time our eyes met, we looked away too quickly. And then it happened again, not planned, not spoken. I don't even remember how we ended up that close, whether it was when I reached to take his plate, or when he leaned to pass me the salt, but suddenly we were inches apart. And just like before, there was no thinking. No decision. We kissed. This kiss was different. Not tentative, not a question, it felt inevitable. When we pulled back, the silence in the room was deafening. The rain was still falling, steady and relentless, as if the world outside didn't care what we'd done. I turned away first, busying myself with dishes that didn't need washing. My hands trembled as I ran water over plates that were already clean. He stayed at the table, his chair creaking slightly when he shifted. Neither of us spoke. There were no apologies, no explanations. Just the hum of the tap, the rain against the glass, and the weight of something we both knew couldn't be undone. That night, as I lay in bed, my husband sleeping soundly beside me, I stared into the dark, every detail of the day replaying in my head, the sound of the rain, the warmth of the kitchen, the kiss that felt like crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross. I pressed my lips together, as if holding the memory there, and wondered how long it would be before the fragile balance of our lives tipped completely. The day after that second kiss moved slowly, as if the hours themselves were hesitant, dragging their feet through the mud of what had already happened. I woke with the sound of rain still faintly in my ears, though by morning it had stopped, leaving the world damp and heavy. The house smelled of wet earth through the cracked kitchen window, and that scent clung to everything, a reminder of yesterday's storm. I tried to move through the day like nothing was different, but nothing felt the same. There was a tremor under the surface of everything, a tension so subtle you might have missed it if you weren't living it. But I was living it. Every look, every movement felt like stepping onto ice that might crack at any moment. My husband was home for breakfast. He sat at the table in his usual spot, shuffling through his phone, occasionally glancing up to comment on the news. I answered with automatic nods and small sounds, my mind elsewhere. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose not to say anything. Sometimes silence is a choice too. The cousin came into the room halfway through, and his presence filled the kitchen instantly. He greeted my husband casually, greeted me with that same small nod, and sat down across from him. They talked about practical things, repairs on the shed, what needed to be done with the car, the paperwork he had driven to deliver the day before. I sat at the end of the table, pretending to read the label on the jam jar, pretending my chest wasn't tight every time his eyes flicked toward me for half a second too long. When my husband left, taking his keys and his jacket, the air in the house changed again. The silence after the front door closed was louder than any sound. The cousin and I didn't speak for a long time. We worked separately, if you could call it work. He sorted through a stack of papers in the living room, and I pretended to clean the same countertop twice. But every so often we crossed paths. In the hallway. By the sink. At the bottom of the stairs. And every time we did, there was that moment, tiny, sharp, where the weight of what we'd done pressed between us. I kept replaying the kiss from the night before, not because I wanted to but because my mind wouldn't stop. It was like an image burned onto film, impossible to erase. I remembered the sound of the rain against the window, the warmth of the kitchen, the way the silence after felt louder than the kiss itself. By midday, I could barely focus. I went outside to the garden just to breathe air that didn't feel so close. The grass was slick from the rain, and the earth gave slightly under my shoes, soft and forgiving. I stood there, staring at the small stone path, the wilted herbs in their pots, the patches of soil where nothing had been planted this season. The house loomed behind me, quiet and still, and I wondered how something so solid could feel so fragile now. I heard the door open behind me, footsteps on the wooden steps. He came outside, his voice quiet as he asked if I needed help with anything. I said no, though I wasn't even sure what I was doing out there. We stood there for a moment, not speaking, just the breeze moving between us. When he stepped closer to hand me the gloves I hadn't realized I'd dropped, our fingers touched, just for an instant. A harmless thing on its own. But harmless things don't make your heart jump the way mine did. I took the gloves, thanked him, and he nodded, stepping back. It was all so simple. Too simple. And yet the silence after seemed to stretch and stretch until it was almost unbearable. Back inside, the afternoon crawled forward. My husband called once to ask if we'd seen the missing folder he needed. I told him I'd look, my voice steady though my hands were shaking slightly as I hung up the phone. I busied myself with laundry, scrubbing the sink, rearranging already neat shelves, tasks meant to distract, though they didn't. He moved through the house quietly, and I found myself listening for him, even when I told myself I wasn't. By early evening, the neighbors stopped by unexpectedly, dropping off something for my husband. Their visit broke the strange rhythm of the day, forcing us to smile, to chat, to stand side by side in the doorway as if everything were as it always had been. I was almost grateful for the interruption, it gave me something to hide behind. But when they left and the door shut, the quiet returned, heavier than before. He lingered in the kitchen as I cleaned up from dinner. The air smelled faintly of soap and something savory that still clung to the plates. He stood near the counter, his hands in his pockets, watching me rinse dishes that didn't really need rinsing. Our eyes met once, briefly, and I looked away too quickly. It was dangerous, that glance. More dangerous than any words could have been. That night, I lay in bed, the dark room too quiet. My husband's breathing was steady beside me, a sound I knew better than my own. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the day, about the silence, about how something so small could feel so massive. I thought about how every movement felt deliberate now. How every glance felt like it might be the one that tipped everything. How guilt and longing could live in the same breath, indistinguishable, impossible to separate. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I knew that whatever it was, we were standing on ice that was getting thinner. And I couldn't stop wondering how long it would hold. The morning started with an odd kind of stillness, the kind that presses down on a house and makes every sound seem sharper. Even the tick of the kitchen clock felt too loud, too present, as I moved through the familiar motions of making coffee, slicing bread, setting things on the table. My husband had already left early for work, he'd mentioned a meeting the night before, almost in passing, but I found myself relieved by his absence in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. The cousin came down later than usual, his steps slow, the kind of steps that seemed to measure each creak of the wooden stairs. He walked into the kitchen, offered a quiet morning, and reached for a cup. We didn't speak beyond that. The air between us had grown thicker over the past few days, stretched thin but weighted at the same time, like a rope pulled too tight. Every shared space felt smaller, every silence louder. That day, it was decided we'd drive out to a neighboring village to pick up some supplies my husband had asked for. It was practical, mundane even, an errand like any other, but I felt a flutter of unease as I tied my scarf and grabbed my bag. The drive wasn't long, but it took us far enough from the house, far enough from the walls that seemed to listen, that everything felt slightly different. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that makes the whole day feel dim before it's even begun. The road was quiet, the fields on either side damp from rain that had passed in the night. We didn't talk much on the way. The few words exchanged were about the road, about which turn to take, about the list of things we needed. But silence filled the car more than words did, and that silence wasn't empty, it carried everything we weren't saying. Halfway there, the car made a strange sound. A low grind, then a louder rattle. He pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching on gravel, and turned the key again. Nothing. Another try, and still nothing. The quiet that followed was broken only by the wind brushing through the trees lining the road. We sat there for a moment, both looking straight ahead, the situation settling over us. He got out, popped the hood, stared at the engine with a frown, but after a few minutes, it was clear there wasn't much to be done. No quick fix, no solution waiting under the metal. "It's dead," he said simply when he slid back into the driver's seat. We checked our phones. The signal was weak, the kind of signal that made calls cut out before they even connected. I suggested waiting, maybe someone would pass by, but the road was empty. No cars, no movement, just the occasional rustle of wind. Eventually, we spotted a small sign a little down the road, an arrow pointing toward a motel barely a mile away. It seemed the only option. The walk was quiet, the gravel crunching under our shoes. The motel was the kind of place that looks exactly the way you expect it to: peeling paint, a flickering sign, a front desk that smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning solution. The clerk barely looked up as we asked for a room, his eyes fixed on the television behind the counter. The transaction was brisk, practical. A key handed over, a muttered room 3. The room itself was small. A single bed against one wall, a dresser with a mirror, curtains that didn't quite close all the way. The air smelled faintly of old fabric and something that might have been lemon cleaner a week ago. We set our bags down. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The weight of the room, of what had led us there, pressed down. There was no storm outside, no sudden rain like before, just an ordinary gray sky, an ordinary room, an extraordinary silence. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the mattress dip slightly under my weight, staring at the worn carpet. He stood near the window, his back to me, his hand resting on the curtain. For a long time, neither of us moved. When he turned, our eyes met. No words were needed. We spent the night together. There isn't much more to say about that moment, and yet there is everything. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sweeping gestures, no declarations. Just a quiet inevitability, like the last piece of a puzzle sliding into place, even if the picture it completed wasn't the one you wanted. The night was long and strangely still. The outside world seemed far away, the road, the broken car, even the house we'd left behind. It was as if time slowed in that room, holding us in a bubble of hours we both knew would burst. In the early morning, I woke to a thin stream of light creeping through the gap in the curtains. The room looked different in daylight, smaller, more ordinary. The air smelled faintly of dust, and the blanket was rough under my hands. We didn't speak much as we dressed, as we gathered our things, as we left the key on the dresser and walked out into the cold morning. The motel door clicked shut behind us, and the sound felt heavier than it should have. The car was towed later, fixed in a garage nearby, and by the time we were back on the road, everything around us seemed unchanged. The fields were still there, the gray sky still hung above us. But nothing was unchanged. When we drove back into the driveway that afternoon, the house looked exactly as it had the day before, but stepping inside felt like crossing into a different world. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband, staring at the ceiling. The dark room felt unbearably quiet, and I knew that silence would never feel the same again. The day after the motel felt hollow, as if someone had taken all the air out of my life and left me walking through rooms filled with nothing but the echo of what I'd done. The house looked the same sagging curtains in the living room, the same chipped mug on the kitchen table, the same familiar hum of the fridge, but I couldn't stop feeling like I was seeing it all from a distance. When I woke, my husband was already gone, off to wherever he went during the long stretches of the day. I stood in the kitchen barefoot, the cold tiles pressing into my feet, staring at the kettle while the water boiled. The hiss of steam seemed louder than usual, the kind of sound that fills the silence and reminds you how deep the silence really is. The cousin came down later. His face looked tired, though I wasn't sure if it was from lack of sleep or the weight of what neither of us dared say. He greeted me softly, not quite meeting my eyes. The polite rhythm of his morning was the same as always, but the space between us was crowded with everything that had happened. We didn't talk much. The small things we said, "Do you want some tea? I'll take the recycling out," were nothing more than placeholders, flimsy words trying to hold back the flood of everything else. Every corner of the house seemed sharper, as though the walls had been listening, as though they knew what we had done. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway felt louder, the creak of the stairs when he climbed them felt like a reminder that there was no undoing it. By midday, I went into the garden just to get away from the closeness of the house. The air outside was damp, the ground still soft from recent rain. I stood by the fence, staring at the same patch of herbs I'd looked at 1,000 times before, but I wasn't really seeing it. I could hear him moving inside, faint thuds of footsteps, the scrape of a chair, and each sound pulled me back like a tug on a rope. At some point, he came out too. He didn't step close this time. He stayed near the door, hands shoved in his pockets, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might say something, that he might try to make sense of what had happened, or ask me to. But he didn't. And maybe that silence was worse than any words could have been. We both went back inside eventually. The house swallowed us again, the walls closing in, familiar yet foreign. The hours moved slowly. He sorted through some papers, I moved plates around in the kitchen, rearranged books that didn't need rearranging, dusted shelves already clean. It wasn't about the tasks. It was about filling space, filling time, trying to make the day move forward when neither of us wanted to look backward. Late in the afternoon, my husband called. His voice was casual, even cheerful, asking if everything was fine at home. I said yes. I said it easily, the way I'd said it 100 times before, but the word felt different in my mouth now. Fine. Everything was fine. But nothing was. When the call ended, I sat at the table, staring at my hands. I couldn't remember what I'd said, only that I'd said what I needed to. That evening, the three of us sat down for dinner. It was the first time we'd all been at the table since the motel. The meal was ordinary, meat, bread, a salad, but every bite tasted like something was caught in my throat. My husband talked about his day, about an upcoming appointment, about the weather turning cold. The cousin nodded, answered when spoken to, but didn't add much else. I felt like I was watching a play, every gesture rehearsed, every line delivered on cue. My husband passed the bread. I smiled when I was supposed to. The cousin looked down at his plate. None of it was wrong. And yet it all felt wrong. When dinner ended, my husband went to his study to finish some work. The cousin and I cleared the table in silence, moving carefully, not looking at each other for longer than a second. When our hands brushed over the same plate, I felt that same jolt, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't longing now, it was guilt, thick and suffocating. Later that night, when I lay in bed, I stared into the dark for a long time. I listened to the sound of my husband breathing, steady and oblivious beside me. And I thought about the motel room. The way the door had clicked shut behind us. The way we hadn't spoken as we left the key behind. The way the car ride back had felt like driving through fog. I thought about what it meant now, to sit across from my husband at the table, to hand him his coffee, to nod when he spoke. I thought about what it meant to see the cousin in the hallway, to hear his voice in the kitchen, to feel the weight of silence between us that would never, ever go away. And as the dark stretched on, I knew something had shifted for good. Even if no one else could see it, even if no one else would ever know, something in me, and something between us, had changed in a way that couldn't be reversed. The days after felt like waiting for a storm that you can see coming but can't predict the moment it will break. Everything was too still, too measured. I woke earlier each morning, the weight of sleep barely touching me anymore, and found myself moving around the kitchen before anyone else was awake, as though being the first one to stir could give me some kind of control. My husband was quieter too, though I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, or if he really felt the tension bleeding into the walls. He went about his routine as usual: coffee, newspaper, the same chair at the same table, but sometimes I caught him staring at nothing in particular, lost in thought. Or maybe I was just seeing guilt where there wasn't any, projecting my own onto him. The cousin and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was always about something trivial: where the box of nails was, how much sugar to add to the tea, whether the shed door needed another coat of paint. It was all surface, all safe, and that made it worse. Because it wasn't the quiet of two people who had nothing to say, it was the quiet of two people holding back too much. Each day felt longer than the last. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the stairs when he came down in the morning. The hum of the refrigerator at night. The way his footsteps and mine overlapped when we passed in the hallway. I started noticing everything about him in fragments: the way he folded his sleeves just once and not twice, the way he left his book open on the table instead of closing it, the way he tapped his fingers lightly when he thought. I shouldn't have noticed any of it. But I did. And those small details became too big, filling the gaps where my thoughts should have been. Sometimes I caught him watching me too. Not for long, not enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough that I knew. Long enough that I felt my breath hitch even when nothing happened. One evening, as the sun was dipping low and casting long, gold shadows across the kitchen, my husband mentioned offhandedly that the cousin wouldn't be staying much longer. "He'll be leaving soon," he said, his voice casual, as if he were talking about the weather. "A week, maybe 2. The words landed like a stone in my chest. I nodded, kept my face still, said something about how the time had gone quickly. But inside, it felt like the floor had shifted. Later that night, I stood at the sink, rinsing plates that were already clean, staring out the window into the dark yard. He came in quietly, setting a stack of folded towels on the counter. He didn't speak right away, and neither did I. We stood there, close but not touching, both pretending to focus on the things in our hands, the things that didn't matter. Finally, he said, almost too softly, "It won't be long now." I turned my head, met his eyes for a moment, and then looked away. I wanted to ask what he meant exactly. I wanted to ask if leaving was his choice or if it was simply inevitable. But the words stayed in my throat. The days that followed blurred. They were full of tiny goodbyes that weren't called goodbyes, him sorting through his things, setting aside what to take and what to leave, clearing his space one object at a time. I found myself watching him more than I should have. How he folded his shirts, how he lined up his shoes neatly by the door, how he paused to write a note and then crumpled it before finishing. I tried to memorize these small things, even though I told myself I shouldn't. At dinner, my husband talked about plans for the garden, about replacing the fence, about the neighbor's new dog. The cousin nodded, answered when spoken to, but his eyes drifted elsewhere. Mine did too. Each night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what hadn't been said pressing down on me. I thought about that motel room, the click of the door, the morning after. I thought about how much had changed in so little time. And I thought about the fact that soon, there would be nothing but silence left. A silence different from the one I'd lived with for years, a silence that wasn't absence, but memory. I didn't know what would hurt more, the days he was here, or the days after he left. The morning of his departure didn't announce itself with fanfare. It came quietly, like most endings do, creeping into the house before I was ready for it. I woke early, as if my body had sensed the shift in the air, and lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. The room was dim, the gray light of dawn seeping through the curtains. My husband's even breathing filled the space beside me, steady and unbroken, while my own chest felt tight with every breath. When I finally got up, the floor felt colder than usual beneath my feet. I made my way to the kitchen, moving automatically through motions I had done thousands of times, filling the kettle, setting mugs on the counter, opening the cupboard for bread. Each small act felt heavier, as though I was moving through water. I heard him come down the stairs. His footsteps were slower than usual, deliberate, like each step was a reminder. He walked into the kitchen with a bag already slung over his shoulder, the strap worn, the zipper slightly open at the corner. Seeing that bag, packed and ready, made my stomach turn in a way I couldn't hide. He greeted me softly, his voice almost neutral. I handed him a mug of coffee, and when our fingers brushed, I felt the smallest jolt, one last reminder of all the unspoken things between us. We didn't talk much. There wasn't anything left to say. Words would have been too sharp, too brittle, and might have broken the thin shell we were holding around ourselves. My husband came in a few minutes later, tying his tie, his voice bright with ordinary cheer. He made small comments about the weather, about the traffic, about how early they'd have to leave to make good time on the road. It was like he had rehearsed these lines, like they were meant to fill the gaps without drawing attention to them. Breakfast passed almost silently. The three of us sat at the table, but the table felt crowded with everything unsaid. He barely ate, picking at the bread on his plate, drinking his coffee too quickly. I forced bites down, tasting nothing. When it was time to leave, he carried his bag to the door. I followed with my hands empty, not knowing what I should be carrying, not knowing what I should be doing. My husband was already outside, loading a few things into the car, calling back into the house to remind him about a folder on the counter. He turned back once before stepping out, his eyes meeting mine. It was only a second, maybe less, but it felt like the room stopped moving. There was no smile, no nod, no gesture to soften the moment, just that look and everything inside it. Then he turned away. The door opened. Closed. I stood there in the hallway, staring at the wood grain of that door like if I stared long enough, it might open again. Outside, I could hear the shuffle of feet on the gravel, the sound of the car trunk closing, the low murmur of voices. Then the car door slammed, and the engine started. The sound faded as the car rolled down the driveway, then down the road, until it was nothing but silence again. The house felt different the moment they were gone. It was quieter, emptier, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. This silence had edges. I walked into the kitchen, sat at the table, and stared at the mug he had left behind. There was still a trace of coffee at the bottom, still the faintest smudge of his fingerprint on the handle. I didn't touch it. The day passed in slow motion. My husband called once to say the trip was going smoothly, his voice the same as always. He talked about the road, about where they'd stopped for gas, about how he'd be home before dinner. I answered with all the right words, my voice calm, even. When the call ended, I sat there, listening to the quiet. Evening came. My husband returned, bringing the weight of normalcy back into the house. He talked about the drive, about how his cousin would be settled soon, about how the paperwork was handled. He washed his hands at the sink, hung up his coat, and asked if there was any bread left. I nodded, moved to slice a piece, my hand steady though everything inside me felt like it was trembling. That night, I lay in bed, staring into the dark. My husband's breathing was steady beside me, the same rhythm it had always been. But I knew that things wouldn't ever be the same again. Not because anyone else would know, not because there would be consequences, but because there was a line that had been crossed, and you can't go back to who you were before you stepped over it. The house would go on. The days would pass. My husband would read the paper in the mornings, and I would pour his coffee. But there would always be this silence underneath, this memory that lived quietly between the walls. And I would live with it.